What is up, YouTube? How y'all doing? This is gonna be another 3-part. This is part 1 of 3 parts. The daycare cover up. Golly. Lord have mercy, man. These people have done so many different things. Y'all hit that subscribe button, hit that bell. I can't, this been sitting up there for so long because it's so long. Hit that subscribe button, hit that bell. Let's just get into it, man. Check this out. Check this out. Check this out.
Her grandchildren started acting strangely last.
Here we go.
Shut down over the summer. That's when this investigation started, and police eventually uncovered 3 counts of
This thing is 4 hours long.
All of the victims are under years old.
Oh, you have anything to say to the families?
An extremely disturbing story here. Local 12's James Pilcher found out today this was not the first time complaints had been filed about this daycare.
We are learning new information surrounding what some consider to be one of the CIA's worst failures in recent history.
1,400 children in this community have been ritualistically.
Now they want answers about why it took so long for this man to be caught. Her grandchildren started acting strangely last fall. She even used a Barbie doll to get her granddaughter to show what happened to her.
Of the 109 pages in the report, 36 are fully blacked out and another 30 substantially blacked out. The top Republican on the House Intelligence Committee says he thinks more should be made public.
At this point in time, my bias would be towards transparency and towards releasing more information.
𝗗𝗢𝗡𝗞𝗦 had worked at that daycare center for just over a year, but employees told investigators he'd been talked to before about his interactions with other little girls there.
The alleged victim is just years old, but told her parents, teachers, and police the same story over and over again. That her teacher, who she calls Mr. Ali, quote, "t***ed her down there while pointing and touching her area, and now it hurts really bad."
Those children, some of them as young as 2 years old, were photographed by the suspects.
Kitty was the primary purpose for the alleged of children.
Wake up, America. We believe the children because once upon a time, we were the children and nobody believed us.
For 7 years, Andrew Bustamante kept secrets. It was his job as a CIA agent.
If it's deemed as secret information, it's supposed to have serious damage, serious risk to national security.
This surveillance video released by Bryant Police shows disturbing events that happened in her classroom back on June 29th, starting with this little girl. According to police, the 8 kids in the room are about 2 years old. When this girl doesn't stop crying, Howell comes back. Howell sits down in front of her, grabs her ankles, and pulls.
That particular day was actually her birthday. These kids are helpless. They can't defend themselves.
The truth about Satanism is they truly do use blood and they mix it with urine, and this is what 1,200 kids have told the sheriff's department.
Once these cases are contaminated, it's almost impossible to know with any degree of certainty what actually happened.
We have heard it 100 times or more from children, the same things, the same games, the same descriptions.
When you are subverting the power of government, that's a fundamentally dangerous thing to democracy. You realize that you might be willing to accept any risk, and it doesn't matter what the outcome is, so long as the public gets to make their own decisions about how that's applied. The greatest fear that I have regarding the outcome for America of these disclosures is that nothing will change.
We all feel completely betrayed. It's so hard to trust your children with people, and we felt like we could really trust them.
While we were driving around San Francisco, beginning our investigation into a notorious ring, we found this place, right near the area we were investigating. It's called the Palace of Fine Arts, and I couldn't help but notice a group of angels staring down at us. And this really made me think. It made us think. Tonight, we were on the trail of a satanic group accused of victimizing 60-plus children that was never held accountable for its actions. We were on the trail of devil worshippers who sought to invert the good in children. And being someone who's struggled with sobriety in the past, who's overcome the darkest of issues in my own life and found a higher power, all I could think about was, why did God abandon these children? What really happened at the Presidio? Right near the watchful eyes of so many angels. Because as it turned out, in the 1980s, this area was less like heaven and a lot more like hell.
So sad, man. We got to help these kids all over the world.
So I am a major proponent of therapy. As you guys probably know, I have gone through a sobriety journey in the last year. I got sober almost a year ago on October 26, 2023. I would not be here if not for my therapist and the therapy sessions that I've gone through. Going to a therapist and seeking out therapy has helped me work through so many internal issues, so many personal issues. I seriously would not be here if I hadn't gotten into therapy to the degree that I have. It's a life-changing service, and I know that it can be a little scary. I know that it's a bit freaky, completely opening up the darkest sides of yourself to a total stranger. But if you've never been to a therapist and never tried therapy, I cannot recommend it enough. BetterHelp is the sponsor of this video, and they're on a mission to make starting therapy easier. BetterHelp is a platform where therapists and their clients can communicate effectively and get the most out of therapy. There's a journal inside of the platform that you can write in for personal reflection, and there are group sessions on a number of different topics available to join every single day. Starting therapy with BetterHelp is extremely easy. Just fill out a simple questionnaire, and you'll be matched with a therapist in a few days. And something that I love about BetterHelp, I've used it for about a year. I've had lots of experience with the platform. If at first you don't enjoy the therapist that you're matched with, you're not vibing, you can switch therapists. And if you're not vibing with them, you can switch therapists again and again until you finally find the person that you feel comfortable opening up to.
Great.
If you're struggling and feel like you benefit from a therapy session, just click the link in the description of my video or go to betterhelp.com/theparanormalfiles to get 10% off your first month of therapy. Once again, just click the link in the description or the pinned comment, or go to betterhelp.com/theparanormalfiles to get 10% off your first month of therapy. And now let's move on to the video. This is a very, very dark, disturbing story that a lot of you are probably going to have to go to therapy after hearing. So yeah, with all that said, let's get into this.
Wow. Oh my God, man. Y'all hit that subscribe button, hit that bell.
There was any kind of satanic ritual or satanic cult activity in a daycare center.
Today's episode is going to be extremely disturbing, and we cover some of the darkest material we've covered here on the show to date. So get ready for a story of Satan, mind control, ritualized cover-ups, lies, government secrecy, and even murder. This is a story that every American needs to know about, and it's my passion to expose these people. So without further ado, let's do a deep dive into this. And I just want to state outright, I have no intention of if you know what I'm saying. You can also fact check everything that I say in this video using the resources document in the description. And also, all parties are presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. What we're doing here is reporting on already reported facts and telling you the full story that the government, the US government, doesn't want you to hear. The Presidio daycare scandal is one of the darkest chapters in American history. It's a tale of satanic rituals, fires, murder, and cover-ups. And it's a story that almost nobody in America knows about. This story is very dark and very disturbing, so viewer discretion, once again, is advised. Before we get into the story of the that occurred at the Presidio, however, we need to talk a little bit about the Presidio complex itself. The Presidio of San Francisco, originally known as El Presidio Real de San Francisco, is a historical park located on the northern tip of the San Francisco Peninsula. Established in 1776 by New Spain as a fortified settlement, it was created to secure Spanish interests in Alta California and the San Francisco Bay Area. After passing to Mexico in 1820 and then to the United States in 1848, the Presidio served as an active military post for over 2 centuries before being transferred to the National Park Service in 1994 as part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area. This marked the end of its 219 years of military use and the start of its transition into a public park with both commercial and recreational facilities. In 1996, the U.S. Congress established the Presidio Trust to manage the park's interior land, while the coastal areas remained under the National Park Service's oversight. The trust was tasked with making the Presidio financially self-sufficient by 2013, a goal it achieved by 2005, well ahead of schedule. This unique management structure allowed the park to become a financially sustainable entity while preserving its historical significance. Recognized as a California Historical Landmark in 1933 and a National Historic Landmark in 1962, the Presidio is noted for its natural beauty, with scenic views of the Golden Gate Bridge, San Francisco Bay, and the Pacific Ocean. Throughout its long military history, the Presidio played a significant role in many U.S. conflicts, particularly in the Pacific Rim. It was the assembly point for the American forces invading the Philippines during the Spanish-American War and served as headquarters for the Western Defense Command during World War II. It was at the Presidio that Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt signed orders for the internment of Japanese Americans in 1942, a decision made under Executive Order 9066. The Presidio also contributed troops to Operation Desert Storm in 1991, marking one of its final military engagements. It was home to the Letterman Army Medical Center, which provided medical care to wounded soldiers through many 20th century conflicts. And that building, before it was demolished, was said to be extremely haunted. Today, the Presidio contains the San Francisco National Cemetery, one of only 2 remaining cemeteries within the city. Among those interred are prominent military figures like General Frederick Funston and General Irvin McDowell. The park also includes a historical walking trail as part of the Trails Forever initiative. This trail features interpretive signage about the area's rich history, including its use as a burial ground for merchant seamen. The Presidio has evolved from a military stronghold to a cherished public space that honors its historical legacy while offering recreational and educational opportunities to visitors. So, back in the day, the Presidio was a powerful, powerful place. A location that held significant strength through the United States Army, a place that contained, obviously, many high-level secrets within. Secrets that, slowly but surely, are making their way out from the shadowy fortified walls of the Presidio and into the library of public knowledge. For example, one mysterious event in the Presidio's history was the death of a nuclear scientist. You see, in 1953, the Presidio campus in San Francisco became the setting for a chilling and mysterious event involving William Curtis Twitchell, a brilliant chemist deeply involved in atomic research. Twitchell, born in Minnesota in 1917, had an impressive career with degrees from Rollins College and UC Berkeley. By 23, he was a project engineer at UC's radiation lab, working alongside future Manhattan Project scientists like Glenn Seaborg, Ernest Lawrence, and J. Robert Oppenheimer. During World War II, their focus shifted to nuclear weapons development, a critical effort for the US military. And eventually, as the Cold War began, William Curtis Twitchell remained an advocate for atomic advancements, including a proposed supercyclotron to reverse atomic bomb processes. But in 1952, Twitchell's promising life took a dark turn when he was diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor. Recognizing the potential risk posed by his declining health, the US government moved him to a newly built secure ward at the Letterman Army Hospital inside of the Presidio, fearing that he might reveal sensitive nuclear secrets as he lost control of his faculties. So essentially, this nuclear scientist was hidden away in a private wing of a hospital specially constructed for him because the government was afraid that if he started getting older and losing his faculties, like I said, he'd spill top secret information. The Atomic Energy Commission spent $100,000, or almost $1 million today, to construct a special ward with restricted access, ensuring only carefully screened medical professional, including one trusted nurse, attended to him. But despite the intense secrecy surrounding his hospitalization, Twitchell's condition became public upon his death on March 23, 1953. And as the news spread around America that a nuclear scientist had been given his own top-secret hospital wing to die in at the Presidio, the Atomic Commission was forced to reveal to the public that similar isolation wards were being used across the country to safeguard nuclear secrets. There were multiple top-secret hospital wards erected for these dying nuclear scientists, wards which were costing the American government millions of dollars. Although the existence of these wards were confirmed by the Commission, the exact locations of the others and the number of locations was never fully revealed or discovered. Eventually, Twitchell's body was returned to Minnesota where he was buried. Although there are no specific ghost stories about Twitchell at the Letterman Hospital, a local legend tells of a mysterious figure boarding a Mooney bus in the Presidio, only to vanish without a trace. Some have speculated that this could be Twitchell, returning from beyond the grave in a final attempt to reach his Berkeley home. So, as you can see, the Presidio itself was no stranger to covering up government secrets or engaging in hush-hush top-secret affairs. But the Presidio was going to be thrust into the national spotlight in the late 1980s when the sordid affair of the Presidio daycare scandal began to unfold. So I took the following reporting from Linda Goldston, a former reporter for the San Jose Mercury News in California. A lot of this article that I'm reading from essentially is Linda's writing. I've taken a ton of different words and swapped stuff out, moved the structure around, and I've added a ton of new information that's come out since this whole thing was published. But Linda went incredibly in depth with the Presidio story, and like I said, I'm going to present her findings and article. I just absolutely loved the way that Linda told the story and walked people through it. Plus, it's almost the same as how anybody else would tell this story, but this is an excellent summary of the Presidio case. I want to give credit where credit is due. This is all information I had come across in my own independent research before, so I was able to corroborate it. And I'm sure that by the end of this, you're going to be convinced that something sinister was happening on the Presidio campus in the late 1980s. So let's get into this extremely dark and twisted story. Even before Joyce Tobin arrived at the daycare center on November 14th, 1986, she suspected that something was wrong. Her neighbor Karen Thomas had just called her up to say that Joyce's 3-year-old son had begged to go home with her when she picked up her own child at the Child Development Center that morning. That's the name that they had for the preschool and daycare center, the Child Development Center. According to her friend Karen, Joyce's son said he didn't want to stay for daycare after his preschool class ended. When Karen told the boy that she couldn't take him with her, Joyce Tobin's son turned to his preschool teacher and asked if he could stay with her, but she had no choice. At the time that she received this news from her friend, Joyce Tobin was at a dentist's office on the other side of town and had arranged for her son to be taken from his preschool class at the Childhood Development Center to hourly care until she could pick him up. Until the boy started preschool 2 months earlier, he had been left at center once or twice a month for a period of 2 years. This was actually only the second time that Joyce's son had been left in hourly care since September of that year, both times while his mother had medical appointments that she couldn't bring him with to. The preschool, like I said, otherwise known as the Child Development Center, and the hourly care programs were both run by the United States Army at the Presidio of San Francisco. And on that day that changed her life forever and the lives of her family, Joyce Tobin arrived at the Presidio Daycare Center at 2:30 p.m. to finally pick up her son. When she entered the child care center, Joyce's son appeared to be napping with several other children, and the teacher, 𝗟𝗓𝗓𝗏, was sitting at a table in the room watching over the kids. When Joyce asked how her son had been that day, Gary said the boy had been upset and hadn't eaten his lunch. He called the child a darling little boy and suggested that Joyce bring him to the daycare center every other day so that the boy could get used to him. That's a quote. According to 𝗟𝗓𝗓𝗏, a lot of 3- and 4-year-olds had trouble coming to his daycare room. He suggested that they were intimidated by the older children in the class and that they simply had to adjust to being separated from their parents. That night, while watching television with his older brother, Joyce's 3-year-old son started playing with his pulling it forward with both hands up and letting it go. "Mr. Gary, do it," he said, and kept at it. Upon hearing this, the young boy's brother ran to fetch their mother, who was talking to a neighbor in the front doorway. Trying to keep her voice calm, Joyce approached her 3-year-old and asked him what he was talking about. The child's reply was terse and grim. "He touched my with his hand and he bit my he told his mother. The boy then made a chomping sound with his mouth. Asked if Mr. Gary had done anything else, the boy said, quote, "He put a pencil in my he do that to me. He hurt me and I cry and cry," end quote. Joyce Tobin in that moment was unsure what to think. "It seemed too impossible and horrible to be true," she said later. "I also thought how awful it would be to accuse someone of this if it were not true. But as she watched her son that evening, he seemed different, anxious, upset. In fact, she watched her young son bite his nails and turn his head away from her. He seemed nervous and disturbed. When Joyce's husband, Captain Mike Tobin, came home, the couple decided to observe their son over the weekend. They agreed they wouldn't question him, but they would indeed wait and listen closely to see if he said anything more. At bedtime, Joyce, who had been trained as a nurse, examined her own son's Immediately, she noticed that it seemed a bit swollen and red. That night, the 3-year-old came to his parents' bedroom crying. He said he was scared. He said he wanted to sleep with them. During the next few days, what had seemed at first too impossible and horrible to be true wouldn't go away. And as both Joyce and Mike tuned in, they listened in horror as their son continued to talk about Mr. Gary hurting him. The following Tuesday, on November 18th, 1986, Joyce Tobin was driving through the Presidio with her son. When they came to the intersection where she would have turned to go to the daycare center, her 3-year-old son raised himself up out of his car seat as if he were attempting to get out and started to cry. "Are you taking me to daycare?" he screamed. "I don't want to go to daycare. Mr. Gary hurt me and I cry." Seeing how distressed her child had become at the concept of being dropped off at the daycare, Joyce reassured him that they were not going to go there, and he calmed down. However, even though her son had settled down, Joyce couldn't. That incident was the final straw that broke the camel's back, and seeing her son react like that, Joyce was convinced that she should contact the daycare center. So, on Wednesday, November 19th, she called the director of the daycare center, a woman named 𝗟𝗓𝗡𝗞𝗦, and asked for an appointment to discuss her son's allegations. But despite the seriousness of the complaint, 𝗟𝗓𝗡𝗞𝗦, the director, said she couldn't see Joyce until Friday, 2 days later, which is shocking. Here you have a mother calling the director of a daycare and alleging that her son was raped by one of the employees, and it seems like she doesn't care. However, within a half hour of the call, Joyce was called at home by one of her son's preschool teachers, who wanted to know what the problem was. Joyce was very confused in that moment. You see, she hadn't told a single employee of the daycare center about the allegations, besides the center's director, 𝗟𝗓𝗡𝗞𝗦, on the phone call. In a bizarre twist, however, it turns out that the entire daycare center staff had been told immediately about Joyce's call and the allegations. Literally, almost immediately after Joyce had spoken with Diana, the director, Diana had phoned up the staff of the center and informed them that these allegations were being made. This was on Wednesday. And bizarrely, authorities who were contacted did not search the center until Friday. This would have given any predator employees ample time to clear out any evidence that they held within the walls of the daycare center. Joyce Tobin never got the meeting that she had wanted with 𝗟𝗓𝗡𝗞𝗦. The case broke before then. On Thursday, November 20th, Mike Tobin spoke with the chaplain at the Presidio and informed the chaplain of his son's allegations. And the chaplain then contacted the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. Officers from the CID, or Criminal Investigation Division, then acted immediately and made an appointment to interview and videotape the boy about his allegations. And this is what really kicked this whole thing off. On the morning of November 21st, the Tobin son was interviewed by officers from the Army's Criminal Investigation Division in a videotaped session. He was then afterwards examined at the Child Adolescent Referral Center, or CASARC, at the San Francisco General Hospital. CASARC reviews more than 700 cases of suspected sexual abuse every single year. Among other things, the CASARC staff had often heard children describe as having a pencil put in their bottoms, just like the Tobin son had described it. In fact, they had heard children describe with this pencil analogy so many times that it had practically become common knowledge as to what it meant amongst the group members. And when Dr. Kevin Coulter examined the Tobin son, he observed that the child's dilated to approximately 20 millimeters in approximately 5 seconds, a much faster and wider dilation than normal. Dr. Kevin Coulter had conducted more than 300 examinations of children at CASARC throughout his time spent as a medical provider there. He had seen children that had been raped before and had analyzed every inch of their bodies to find confirming evidence of these crimes. His conclusion that day was that such rapid and wide dilation was caused by trauma to the and consistent with. It turned out that the child hadn't been lying. Dr. Kevin Coulter then informed the parents that, after their examination, he had determined that their 3-year-old son had been sexually abused. A flurry of meetings at the Presidio followed the revelation that the Tobin boy had been abused. Secret meetings, many undocumented and informal. But even with all this activity, these meetings in boardrooms and in buildings across the campus, the Army seemed to be in no hurry to proceed with the sexual abuse case. In fact, it took the Army 12 days to form a strategy group and to really begin investigating. And it took the Army almost an entire month to notify the parents of other children who had been in Mr. Gary's class that a student in their classroom had allegedly been raped by the teacher and that their own children might be at risk. Nearly a year would pass before more than 59 other victims, children between the ages of 3 and 7, had been identified. And allegations would be made by parents that several more children were even after the investigation had begun. Usually, when allegations of rape and sexual abuse are made against the caregivers and employees of a childhood daycare center, the center shuts down. And keep in mind, this wasn't just an average daycare center ran by private United States citizens. This was the Childhood Development Center and Daycare at the Presidio, under the care of the United States Army. And this complicates things even further. You see, daycare centers under state jurisdiction, like the Child Development Center, are routinely closed when an incident is confirmed, but the Presidio Center stayed open for more than a year after the Tobin's son said that Mr. Gary had him. A strategy meeting on December 10th set the tone for the case. The meeting was attended by all of the brass from the Presidio, representatives of the FBI and the U.S. Attorney's Office, and staff from the Child Adolescent Sexual Abuse Referral Center. The CASARC workers told the Army to expect multiple victims, so many victims that they couldn't even offer their help. But the Army didn't want to believe that. That's a quote. Says one CASARC worker who attended the meeting. 5 days later, on December 15th, letters were mailed to 242 parents whose children were in Hambright's classes. The letter said, "The commander of the Presidio of San Francisco has been apprised of a single incident of alleged child abuse reported to have occurred at the Presidio Child Development Center. We have no reason to believe that other children have been victimized." End quote. Many parents who received that letter took the Army at its word. Many of them didn't learn until the following April, after the Tobins and other parents forced the Army to send out another letter, informing parents that their children may have been victims. Other parents found out right away and had known for a while. That's because the children had already begun to talk before these letters were sent out, before this was a known issue. And these kids kept talking. That was the problem. They kept saying things that no one, especially not the Army, wanted to hear. Other children, not the Tobin's son, kept mentioning people besides Mr. Gary, other locations besides the daycare center. Here are a few of the allegations the other children began to make.
Wow.
Some of the children said they were taken from the daycare center to private homes on the Presidio campus where they were abused by multiple people. 2 houses were singled out on the Army post and at least 1 home off post in San Francisco. One girl said she played poo-poo baseball at the home of one of her female teachers. The young girl said the game involved throwing fresh feces at the teacher. Other children talked about playing the goo-goo game with Mr. Gary. It involved Gary Hambright allegedly having the children and on him. Then he would do the same to them. Sometimes the children said they were forced to drink urine and eat feces. Some even said they had blood smeared on their bodies. And other children said they had guns pointed at them. Some of the victims even claimed they were told they or their parents would be hurt or killed if they told anybody what happened. One 3-year-old boy said he was on his first visit to the daycare center. That day also happened to be his birthday. A 3-year-old girl said Mr. Gary used special pens, black, blue, pink, and red, to doodle on her body, starting at her legs and moving up over her. The same child said she saw one of her friends at the center cry when Mr. Gary's friend, a woman, pointed a gun at the friend. There were also, and this is a big part of this, 5 confirmed cases of chlamydia, a sexually transmitted disease, found in the children. That's right, there were 5 children that were making accusations that were all diagnosed with chlamydia, including 2 of the 4 daughters of one family. And the Army has been very secretive about these tests. We still don't know the extent of the testing, who tested positive for what, how many kids were even tested. People have tried to get that information and they just refuse to release it. And a preliminary test for one boy for AIDS ended up coming back positive. Further tests, though, revealed that he didn't have the disease, but fear of AIDS tormented parents for months. Now, these allegations were already horrific. These kids were all independently reporting their abuse to their parents, going into graphic detail, but for some people, allegations alone aren't enough. In my mind, and in the minds of many others, allegations made by children should always be taken seriously. But these weren't just allegations. A major discovery was about to be made. So as you can see, this whole affair was brewing into a fever pitch. Dozens of children were reporting graphic details of sexual assaults, torture, and bizarre cult-like behaviors. Children were being diagnosed with STDs, and doctors were confirming that it appeared they had indeed been abused. But the worst was yet to come. You see, despite these rumors and allegations, the Army, the FBI, and the U.S. Attorney's Office were united in wanting one thing: a simple, single predator case. The Army, as always with these sorts of things, wanted the matter over with as quickly and quietly as possible. And the prosecutors involved wanted a case that they knew they would win. I'll even go a step further and posit that the powers that be that were involved in this whole thing wanted a scapegoat for the affair. A singular person that they could pin all of this and all of these disgusting allegations on. In the mind of the prosecution, the more unusual the allegations that they attempted to prosecute, the harder it would be to win in court. So, a lot of these children's testimonies they didn't think were good enough to use. And in addition, if they were to entertain the allegations of fecal consumption and gunplay, then that would be a sort of admission that these sorts of things were actually possible. And that's something the government obviously doesn't want to admit to. So on January 5th, 1987, Gary Willard Hambright, Mr. Gary, was arrested. Gary Hambright, 35 years old, was an ordained Southern Baptist minister without a pulpit. After Gary moved to the Bay Area of San Francisco in 1977 from his home in Tacoma, Washington, he worked as a substitute teacher in the San Francisco School District before taking the $7.59 per hour job at the Child Development Center on the Presidio campus in 1985. At his eventual arraignment, Gary described himself openly as an educator, not a criminal. His close friend, Gordon Grover, a beauty salon owner, said that the thin, pale man with blonde hair, aka Gary, was, quote, probably one of the most gentle people you will ever know, end quote. He's always got time to give kids a hug when they're crying, Grover was quoted as saying at the time. He's just a really kind person. After he was arrested, Gary got out on bond and took part-time jobs cleaning houses and washing windows in order to pay off his mounting legal bills and day-to-day expenses. While facing the most horrific of charges, Gary stayed with his friends on couches and in spare bedrooms, and continued to be closely associated with the Dolores Street Baptist Church in San Francisco. The indictment that Assistant U.S. Attorney Susan Gray had sought from the grand jury charged Gary Hambright with only one child. In the actual documents, he was accused of and committing a lewd and lascivious act on a child. In March, 3 months after Gary Hambright's arrest, all of the aforementioned charges were dismissed. At the time, and in the press, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer, who was overseeing the case, stated that he refused to allow the admission of so-called hearsay statements, specifically the comments that Tobin's 3-year-old son made to his brother and mother, and to the nurse and the doctor who examined him about the abuse. Several states allow exceptions of the hearsay rules in child cases, but federal courts and California state courts do not. Furthermore, U.S. District Court Judge William Schwartzer refused the hearsay evidence on March 4th and ruled that the Tobin son would not qualify as a competent witness because of his age. Essentially, this ruling, at least in my mind, states that a child cannot be a witness to a crime against them. This is not only a major slap in the face to all victims of childhood abuse, but a direct slap in the face of justice as well. On March 20th, 1987, the U.S. Attorney's Office asked that the charges against Gary Hambright be dismissed without prejudice, meaning that he could possibly be retried if new evidence ever emerged. Prosecutor Susan Gray, at the time, directly informed the judge that she was aware of at least 12 more children that were claiming very similar things had happened to them at the hands of Mr. Gary. She informed him that not only were these allegations similar, but they mentioned the same perpetrator that the Tobin son had mentioned, and mentioned similar patterns and methods of Prosecutor Susan Gray, as it turned out, had counted on the fact that the judge would allow the admission of statements that the Tobin son made to his brother on the day he first said Mr. Gary heard him, as well as the similar comments he made to the nurse and doctor who examined him and to the agents that interviewed him afterwards. The medical evidence and the perfect witness parents had made her even more confident when she was building this case, and she felt pretty confident that she'd be able to get a conviction. That's because Joyce Tobin herself, the boy's mother, was a nurse. Mike Tobin was a West Point graduate and a nuclear engineer. They had no reason to lie or fabricate these things, and it also added more validity to the examination of the boy's. But the Army's supposed independent and thorough investigation of the Tobin son's allegations had gotten off to a shaky start when Army Criminal Investigative Special Agent Mark Remsen was assigned to interview the child. As it turned out, Special Agent Mark Remsen had never interviewed a child younger than 8 years old, and while Army regulations required that the interview be taped, Remsen had never used a videotaping device while conducting an interview either. This seems like he was the first. It seems like this is this guy's first day of work when you really think about it. I mean, he's completely inexperienced on every single facet that he should be experienced in. The regulation was later changed, but the damage had already been done. The videotape in question was to be singled out repeatedly as an example of how the children had supposedly been coached and prodded to tell their stories. That was the narrative that was already being concocted, that these children were somehow coached to tell these fantastical, incredibly disturbing stories. For what reason exactly it was being alleged that these children were being coached, we still don't know. That's something that we always see too, that, oh, these allegations like this, these parents must have been putting these ideas in these children's heads, or these investigators must have been doing this. I understand that, has happened sometimes in the past. But I mean, a case like this, when you've got all these different children with corroborating evidence, corroborating each other's stories, talking to their parents and their doctors and their therapists who are interviewing them, giving the exact same details, and medical records confirming it, it just doesn't make sense. Joyce Tobin, the boy's mother, according to court records, said that during the interview, quote, apparently, in an attempt to establish rapport with my son, the CID investigator said that Mr. Gsary was bad and should be spanked. He said this numerous times. Thereafter, in the week that followed when my son spoke about Mr. Gsary, he described Mr. Gsary as bad and said he should be spanked. Prior to the CID interview, my son had never said anything like that or attempted to make any value judgment about what had happened to him. He just reported what had happened to him, Joyce Tobin told the prosecution, and this was just the very beginning of the cover-up. Now, we can view this situation in different ways. Maybe, in a skeptic's mind, the investigator really was just inexperienced and said the wrong things at the wrong time. It's indeed plausible, I'll give you that. However, when you consider every other piece of evidence in this case, this behavior seems to paint a bit of a darker picture. Was that investigator attempting to plant false evidence in the child's mind so that later on investigators and officials could take a look at the child's testimony and throw it out based simply on the fact that the kid was repeating lies that the investigator had planted in his own already traumatized mind? It's a tactic that's definitely been used before that I can guarantee you will continue to be used in the future. It's something that we've seen in cases like the Elms Guesthouse case in England that we're going to be investigating here on the channel soon, where false evidence was introduced into a case by the authorities in order to get the legitimate evidence questioned, thrown out, and delegitimized. But that's just food for thought. Let's get back to the story.
Man.
With the
They
charges
are slick.
dismissed at this point, Susan Gray's attempt at securing a simple single conviction had failed. And for a while, the case went cold. No further developments emerged, and no authorities acted to try and find justice in this affair. The courts would not hear of the Presidio again until the end of September 1987, nearly a year after the first allegations were made. Throughout that year, the Tobins were disappointed, but they weren't defeated. In that almost year's time, they had begun calling and writing congressmen, attempting to make noise about the that they in their heart of hearts knew had happened to their son, calling and meeting with army officials at the Presidio itself. By April of 1987, another battle had shaped up outside of the courtrooms. And this was a pretty disturbing development. Instead of actively trying to investigate the alleged that occurred on the Presidio campus, the Army instead had begun insisting that their daycare center was safe, that all the victims had been identified, and that the issue was already solved. But parents who had children enrolled in the daycare and preschool feared otherwise, because they knew that their own children had mentioned people other than 𝗟𝗓𝗡𝗞𝗦, people who still worked at the daycare center, as being involved in the At first, it was just the Tobins alone who kept asking, were proper procedures followed? Was everything necessary really done? Did you check on that? What about the other children? But by April of that year, the Tobins had been joined by other families whose kids claimed they were abused. Families like the Runyons, the Adams-Thompsons, the Dorseys, the Foxes. Most of these people had never met before, but they were to meet many times in the months to come. A massive scandal was brewing. The first priority of all these families was to get another letter mailed to the parents of other children who had attended the daycare center who they felt like the Army and US government had let down and endangered. But the Army saw no need for that. Why are you doing this? Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, the Director of Personnel and Community Activities, asked Mike Tobin. Because parents need to know what's happening, Mike told him during a conversation. That very letter that these concerned families played a part in getting sent out was delayed for 2 more weeks, while Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer argued over whether the number of victims mentioned in the letter should be 32 or 37. 2 weeks for an issue like that? Come on, issues like this need to be acted upon immediately. When Joyce Tobin and fellow victim's mother Brenda Fox went to Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer's office to discuss the finishing and sending of the letter, Meyer told them that he didn't have time to talk, Fox recalls, and she also claimed that he told the 2 mothers that he was on his way to make a videotape about the CDC, about it being a model daycare center. So this powerful military guy didn't have time to talk to the family members of victims, and instead he was prioritizing heading to go film a video about how good and perfect and not scandalous the daycare is. When at the exact same moment, he actually had 2 mothers trying to talk to him whose children were there. Doesn't really make sense. But according to Brenda Fox, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Meyer, during that interaction said, "Despite what you may believe, this is a model daycare center." She later said, "I sat there thinking, this man has no soul. We told him the numbers were wrong. He said, No, they're not. We waited while he called and found out the numbers were wrong. Under the signatures of Joyce and Mike Tobin, Gretchen and Dennis Runyon, Sue and Tom Dorsey, Michelle and Larry Adams Thompson, and Brenda and Don Fox, this letter, dated April 29, 1987, was mailed to parents. We feel you should know that there are now 37 children identified by the authorities as suspected victims. The letter said in part, "We are very concerned that there may be more children affected and in need of help, yet remain unidentified. These parents and families of suspected victims came from all walks of life and all sorts of different backgrounds. The core group of parents at the center of the affair consisted of professionals, doctors, a dentist, a nuclear scientist. They spoke out loud and often, and raised their voices when they needed to. Whenever speaking to the media, the parents claimed they spoke for those who could not, the children and the enlisted people who, they said, were too afraid to risk their military career to speak out about what really happened on the Presidio campus. To them, the only explanation for the silence from all the enlisted people was the fact that they needed their jobs, and that many families, parents, and employees needed that daycare. However, the core group could afford daycare elsewhere. When it first started, they had the chance to be heroes. Melanie Thompson, a parent of one of the victims, once said about the Army. Instead, they just didn't want to believe it. Now they're just trying to cover it up like a bad dream. But as time wore on and more dark truths came to light, this story just kept diving down and down, further and further towards hell. Now, here's something fun. None of the parents who were protesting the Army's handling of the case knew that the signs of trouble had begun to surface at the Child Development Center at least 6 years earlier. And none of these parents knew that the Army had been dealing with problems at its daycare centers for years before the Presidio case broke. When the first allegations broke and concerns arose, the Army said nothing about the prior cases of documented child sex abuse at West Point and Fort Dix. The Army said nothing of an investigation 6 years prior involving John Gunnerson, the Presidio's top daycare official and the supervisor of the daycare center during the time that Gary Hambright allegedly the children. But let's go back in time for a second. In 1982, years before the first allegations were brought forward with the children of the Presidio, a man named John Gunnerson was employed in a somewhat powerful position at the Presidio. His official job title was Child Support Services Coordinator at the Childhood Development Center, responsible for the training of the center's staff. And he was, according to many, a caring, normal man. However, when he was arrested on charges of assaulting an employee of the center, Pearl Broadnax, the opinions of John Gunnerson on the base suddenly shifted. Pearl Broadnax herself had been complaining about conditions at the center and the allegedly deplorable treatment of the children that she witnessed while working there. She claimed that she was branded a troublemaker and was often brought in, questioned, and grilled by her supervisors about her allegedly unsatisfactory job performance. But this whole thing took a dark turn on February 3rd, 1982, when Pearl and Gunnerson argued over the use of scissors by the children. According to Pearl, John asked her to go into another room to continue the discussion, but Pearl said she wanted to remain in the playroom. At this time, according to an investigative report of the incident, Gunnerson grabbed Broadnax by the left arm above her waist and pulled her towards him. She then told Gunnerson, "Don't touch me," to which he replied, "I'm not touching you." She felt that she was in fear of bodily harm at this point in the incident. And when officially questioned, John Gunnerson declined to be interviewed about the incident, but responded to questions through Presidio spokesman Bob Mahoney. "I did not grab Mrs. Broadnax, I did not assault her, and I had no intention of harming her," he related to Mahoney. In the course of our conversation, Mrs. Broadnax became agitated and appeared to be losing control of herself. I attempted to calm her by lightly touching her arm to guide her out from the room where we were talking. At least, that's what John Gunnerson claimed happened. Unsurprisingly, the charge against John Gunnerson was eventually dismissed for lack of evidence. The incident could possibly be dismissed as an unfortunate misunderstanding, except that the ensuing investigation at the time led to more allegations of physical and sexual abuse of children at the same center, according to former military police investigator Ed Albanoski, who was then the chief of juvenile investigations at the Presidio. It seemed like a can of worms had suddenly been opened. Eventually graduating from the Presidio to the title of deputy sheriff in Santa Clara County, Ed Albanoski called the original author of this article Linda Goldston after he read one of her stories about the Presidio case. "When I read the paper, I almost fell out of my chair," he said. "I couldn't believe Gunnerson was still working there." While interviewing Pearl at the daycare center after she had called military police officers about Gunnerson, Ed learned that Pearl was concerned about more than just the alleged threat of harm to herself. She also alleged that employees had touched children's improperly. Pearl had provoked an investigation of the center a year earlier, after talking to parents who said they felt their children were discriminated against because they were minorities. Pearl also said in a documented accusation that she had seen the then director of the center hit a child in the mouth, an injury which caused him to bleed. In a telephone interview from her home in Alabama, Pearl told Linda, the author of the original article, that she had complained many times about the problems at the center during the 4 years she worked there, but, quote, just gave up. Nobody seemed to be concerned. I ended up having a nervous breakdown over that, end quote. She was quoted as saying, right before I left, I saw a woman beat a kid until he just threw up, she said. I did all I could to get something done about that. They removed her, but she was back working there after I left. After Pearl made her thoughts and initial observations and allegations known, Captain Robert J. Meyer was appointed to look into the allegations for the commander of the Presidio. And once again, we'll see a similar pattern here of ignoring issues, allowing problems to fester, and covering up horrific misdeeds. You see, in a letter summarizing his findings, Captain Robert J. Meyer said, at least 3 of the child care center staff have been threatened with the loss of their jobs if they speak out and tell the truth about how the child care center is being managed and how the minority children are treated. After this letter was finished and published, a hearing was held at the Presidio about these allegations in the year 1981. The director in question was placed on leave for a brief moment before being reinstated, and it seemed as if life went right back to normal. All of those allegations were forgotten about, uninvestigated. The physical, the children getting smacked, the other adults and teachers playing with children's. It's almost like that stuff never happened. And so the next year, when Ed Albanoski reported the sex abuse allegations that he had heard to Presidio officials, he was told, quote, to stop any investigation, I was told there was nothing to look into, that Gunnarsson would be dealt with through his command channels, end quote. Military police investigators report number 0019382 MP102682047, dated February 4th, 1982, was filed on the incident. Ed Albanoski, after all these years, still holds on to a copy of that report. He sensed back then that it might be important someday. And thank God he did that, because the Army didn't take this whole thing quite as seriously. This particular case was not known to any of us in the chain of command. Presidio Commander Joseph V. Rafferty said when questioned about those older allegations, Mr. Gunnarsson had one of the finest reputations in the Army with respect to running a child care center. Bizarre, very bizarre to defend a guy accused of physical assault against an employee and sexual assault against children. But a year after he was arrested, John Gunnarsson was cited in an inspection report by officials from the U.S. Army Forces Command for doing an excellent job as the Child Support Services Coordinator. The staff training program he developed utilizing the military child care modules is model for the Army. This glowing praise was showered onto John Gunnarsson just a little over a year after he was accused of physically abusing an employee, physically abusing children, and either taking part in, or at minimum turning a blind eye to the sexual abuse of children there. But even though the Army wasn't listening to them or paying attention, these allegations of abuse at the daycare center would continue to surface. In a somewhat notorious incident, former Army Captain Gary Boswell approached John Gunnarsson in April 1985 after picking up his daughter at the daycare center. She had a red spot on her hand where she had been burned, she said. The teacher burned me. This girl was taking the kids and taking a magnifying glass and holding their hands until they jerked their hand away and cried, said Boswell. I went to see Gunnarsson and wasn't terribly pleased. He said he'd look into it. We came back the next day and he said he had talked to the person, that there were no eyewitnesses, and it's your daughter's word against hers, so we can't do anything. We took our daughter out of the daycare center a short time later. So, according to another independent witness, this female teacher was taking children's hands, putting them under a magnifying glass and burning them. And then, when presented with the child and the injury and the allegations, the director of the center takes no action against the employee and just says, oh, we don't believe the girl. Weird. Then, a year or so later, a mother named Sue Dorsey contacted John Gunnarsson in June of 1986 to complain about a sexual abuse incident she says she witnessed with her own 2 eyes at the center. Sue Dorsey, the wife of Army Captain Tom Dorsey, a physician, said she had just dropped her daughter off at the daycare center and was walking out of the building when she noticed, quote, a woman on her hands and knees, bent over, putting her hands in a little girl's. The woman took her hands out from the little girl's and put them under the little girl's and tickled her on both and then went back down into the vaginal area and tickled her there, end quote. Now obviously this is something really disturbing to see with your own 2 eyes, and Sue knew that whatever the hell she just saw, that it was not right. But after relating the incident to the assistant director of the center, Sue said she was told a similar story, a similar story to the other similar stories that other concerned parents and employees were told over the years. Sue was told that the grown adult woman that she had seen the little girl in was just playing innocent tickling games. But Sue Dorsey wasn't satisfied with this response, so she then went to John Gunnarsson, who, she says, replied, "So what you're telling me is that she tickled the little girl on her parts." After this conversation, according to Sue, she then returned home and called Gunnarsson later in the day. He said, "I'm going to write something up in her personnel file." But once again, Sue felt that this wasn't enough action. Finally, after further calls to the captain who supervised the civilian employees at the center, Sue got some good news. She was told that the Army's Criminal Investigation Division, or CID, would investigate the case. But Colonel Rafferty would later comment on the investigation, saying that it proved that it could not be substantiated that any had occurred. From my understanding of the actual involved, there was a question of just exactly what was clearly a tickling type of incident that could be interpreted in a couple of different ways. I suspect the investigators took the caregiver's interpretation of what it was. After all that effort, after trying to raise the alarm that was occurring at the Presidio for months, Sue Dorsey had gotten nowhere. She was told time and time again that this would be all looked into, that some sort of action would be taken, but nothing ever happened. Time and time again, these investigations and investigators claimed, yeah, we looked at it, but we're just going to believe the perpetrator. Screw the victim. We don't care about what they're saying. Sue Dorsey was defeated, and a year later, Sue Dorsey learned that her own daughter had been abused while at the Presidio Child Care Center. Sue Dorsey and the other parents would also learn that there had been abuse cases involving daycare centers at several other Army bases across the U.S.
Wow.
Cases of abuse that were hidden from the mainstream media and in a way covered up. One of the most serious cases of child sex abuse occurred at West Point. That is, until the Presidio. In July 1984, a 3-year-old girl was brought to the emergency room at the West Point Hospital with a lacerated. The child at the time told the doctor who examined her that a teacher at the West Point daycare center was the one who hurt her, that a teacher was the one who had damaged her area. In August of 1984, at West Point, another parent came forward. By the end of the year, 50 children had been interviewed by investigators. Starting to sound familiar? Well, the similarities do not end there. The children at West Point, years prior to the emergence of the stories of the children at the Presidio, told stories that would, in time, become horrifyingly familiar. The children said that they had been ritually abused. They said that they had excrement smeared on their bodies and had been forced to eat feces and drink urine. They also said they were taken away from the daycare center and photographed while they were being. And these children also said that they were told if they ever told anyone anything about what was happening to them, either they or their families would be killed. Sounds exactly like the allegations from the Presidio. Some parents at the time alleged that they believed the Army had tried its best to cover up these cases. The whole underlying theme was that the image of West Point was more important than dealing with the reality of what happened, said Dr. Walter Grote, whose 2-year-old daughter was among the children allegedly abused at the center.
This is Dr. Walter Grote, would you stand, sir? Whose daughter was allegedly abused at West Point, the United States Military Academy. You were a captain in the United States Army. Aside from what allegedly happened to your daughter, which I know you allege was part of a satanic cult, and having nothing to do with this man, I state again for the record, what is your feeling, sir, on the fact that a serving officer in the United States Army is also a professed Satanist, a high-ranking person?
Well, I think in this election year, we've heard a lot about values, Geraldo. We've heard a lot that our little children should be saying the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag. Mr. Aquino has identified himself as an antichrist. He preaches that as the leader of the Temple said. I don't think I'm misquoting him. I find it inconceivable that we can have candidates talking about one nation under God and having our children say that, yet by the same token, we can have somebody in our army as a colonel leading our troops in battle who are opposed to the very concept of God and whose whole purpose it is to fight against God.
At the time that the article about this was written, Dr. Walter Grote had moved on and moved to a different state, where he had a private medical practice in New Jersey. A former Army captain, Dr. Walter Grote actually turned down a promotion to major in 1984 to protest the Army's handling of the daycare case at West Point. He was, once again, just like the other parents, well aware that the problem at the point had started long before. In August of 1983, nearly a year before the case broke out at West Point, a 22-month-old child had been murdered by the mother's boyfriend, an Army staff sergeant. After a court-martial hearing, the sergeant was given an 18-month suspended sentence and dishonorable discharge. Yes, you heard that correctly. A man had murdered his girlfriend's 22-month-old child and was given no prison time. Colonel Richard C. Eckert, a doctor that was then in charge of West Point's child protection case management team, was outraged at the leniency of the sentence. I mean, seriously, who in their right mind wouldn't be? In an August 1st, 1983 letter to Lieutenant General Willard Scott Jr., the then superintendent of West Point, Colonel Richard Eckert wrote, "The community has received a devastating message. West Point and the Army take child lightly and do not consider it a major offense." Yes, those words are in writing. And yes, those words rang true. The guy that murdered the 22-month-old baby was let off scot-free, said Dr. Pat Jones, a former pediatrician at West Point who moved away from the area and eventually opened up a private practice in Texas. They just kicked him out of the Army to prevent any publicity. Dr. Pat Jones, who believes his 15-month-old daughter was at the center at West Point, was so outraged that he resigned from the Army. "I tried to resign from the Alumni Association. I feel ashamed for even being from that place," he was quoted as saying. But once again, at the end of the day, no indictments were returned in the West Point cases. Not a single adult was held liable for the abuse of dozens of children, and nothing came out of it, even though everyone involved, mainly the victims' families, knew that all of this was true and very real. No justice was served. Fort Dix was next. In July of 1986, 2 female employees were accused of sexually abusing 4 3-year-old girls on the Fort Dix campus.
Wow.
Once again, we see a similar pattern and start to hear a similar story here. No indictments were returned in the case, and the women returned to work at the same daycare center. I don't know why they just keep letting these predators keep returning to work, but they did. Then it was Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, and after that, Fort Jackson, South Carolina. By November 1987, the Army had received allegations of child abuse at 15 of its daycare centers and several elementary schools. This seemed to be an epidemic. There were also at least 2 cases of reported child sexual abuse in Air Force daycare centers as well, and at a daycare center run by the Navy in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. In that case, a civilian was sentenced to 3 years in prison for children. This was one of the only cases where the allegations were investigated seriously, and the affair ended with a conviction. So, seeing all of these problems arising, the Department of Defense decided in April of 1987, in the middle of the Presidio scandal, to form special strike teams to investigate cases in the military. The goal of the teams is to not let things get any worse, said Bob Steen, director of the Military Family Resource Center at the Department of Defense at the time that the original article was written. "We need to be better prepared to deal with the magnitude of the problem. I don't think anybody was prepared at the Presidio or West Point," he claimed. But despite the military's official stance of preparedness, a new horror surfaced in June 1988, when a special team of experts was sent to Panama to help determine if as many as 10 children at a Department of Defense elementary school had been and possibly infected with AIDS by a teacher who was, at the time, dying of the disease.
Wow.
Interestingly enough, right now, in the year 2024, when I attempted to research that case of the Department of Defense elementary school in Panama, I couldn't find any information online relating to the affair. I don't even know what ended up happening, or if there ever was any conclusion to this story or these claims. But after hearing all that, you can see that these things were happening all across America, tied in directly to the Army or Navy, and nothing was being done about it. They were very similar, and these claims were all ignored and shut down. But let's get back to the Presidio. Although the allegations of ritual made by children at West Point and at the Presidio were similar, we may never totally resolve whether there is any kind of external organization of abuse, or if just a single was involved in those cases, said Colonel Jim Schley, Deputy Director of the Military Family Resource Center. But some of the allegations made by children at the Presidio, that they were taken to houses on and off post by men and women, led to an investigation of the possibility that there was an external organization in San Francisco, a ring of sorts that was operating with the darkest and most disturbing of intentions. So let's talk about
crazy,
that.
Man.
This is where the devil comes to play.
As sickening and unbelievable as it sounds, bearing children for use in satanic rituals may really be happening.
My daughter, who I named Wendy, was sacrificed at birth with an upside-down cross and then taken outside and buried. My son, they kept and let live till 2 years old, and then he was sacrificed.
Michael and I had a son, and he was dedicated to Satan at birth, and at 6 months of age, he was sacrificed to Satan.
It is most common for the heart to be taken from a child and offered to Satan.
These women say they speak from personal experience. They claim to be breeders, forced by covens to bear children, both as a way for the cults to get new members and to find fresh victims for ritual murder. Did you give birth to infants who were sacrificed?
My first two.
Were sacrificed?
Were sacrificed. I was told it was the highest honor I could ever do as a woman, was to sacrifice my first two.
And you did that?
I was so brainwashed, I believed their philosophy.
Jackie tells us she was able to escape her satanic cult.
Come on,
Today she helps
y'all.
other women, like Donna, who are trying to break free.
You killed your babies?
That's a yes or no.
Skin off.
You skin the baby? You take the baby's skin off? Do you feel remorse? Have you told the police?
I had to do what I had to do, or I'd be killed like the babies that they made me watch killed, and that they put in my hand. They said, "Obey, or this is you."
Jackie, you have some pictures drawn during the therapy sessions by the people who've been through this. Why don't you show me some of them?
This picture is a person remembering skinning children and babies and hanging it out to dry. And
Skinning
them, taking the skin off alive while they are alive, and skin them until they die.
And that's how your babies died?
They took a little patch about 3 by 4 off of her stomach, skinned her, and said, "We'll skin you all the way if you talk or cry." You learn not to cry real fast.
I don't cry.
In the 1980s, you see, the Presidio wasn't the nice, refurbished, posh area that it is today. All across the campus, there sat abandoned buildings and shacks that littered the landscapes, structures reminiscent of a time when the campus saw a lot more action. And inside a concrete bunker behind the military intelligence building at the Presidio, the words "Prince of Darkness" were painted boldly in red on one wall. Used decades ago to house artillery guns, the reinforced concrete batteries appeared to have been converted to something like ritual chambers. I'm also going to note that at the time that this article was written, in the middle of 1988, these structures were still standing on the Presidio campus. As of today, they are gone. This abandoned...
Oh my God, man. This is... Stay tuned for part 2. Stay tuned for part 2. How in the world can you think, y'all got to explain. They are explaining this to me in our live channel. How can somebody be so feared and so tricked into doing something that's so negative as killing? Not only killing, but killing a baby. Not only killing a baby, but killing your own baby. We got to do something, y'all. And I think if everybody were to try to focus on helping others, help people is what we're trying to do, man. Oh my goodness. I don't even know how to end this, man. How in the world can you overlook children having transmitted disease that you can only get through S? How can you overlook that? Military? Oh my gracious, man. Then the parents that overlook because they need to keep their job. You mean to tell me that your son, daughter is telling you that they are being abused at a daycare and all you can think of is keeping your job? Really? Really? This is what's happening. Look here, man. Y'all pay attention. Stay tuned for part 2. Y'all take it light, take it slow. Tell them Uncle Mike told you so. Peace out.